I wish you were my son," he said, his voice low and begrudging, unaware of who I really was. His son, my actual brother seated next to him, let out a derisive laugh, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment I would confront my family and my past. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of nerves and resolve flooding my chest. They had no idea who I really was, but I was done hiding. I'd spent years preparing for this, building a life they'd never believed I was capable of, only for them to unknowingly come to me for help when they needed it most. My name is Danielle, and I'm 30 years old. A lawyer, a wife, a mother, these are the titles I've earned. But for those who don't know my story or didn't watch the first video about my life, let me take you back so you can understand the context and fully embark on this journey with me. I was born into a traditional family with strict expectations and little room for deviation. My parents' entire world shifted when my younger brother was born. He was everything they had hoped for, a boy to carry on their legacy, the golden child who could do no wrong. And me? I was deemed unnecessary. They saw me as a burden, a girl with no role in their carefully planned future. When I was just 6 years old, they made the unthinkable decision to leave me at an orphanage. They told me it was for my own good, that I'd have a better life. But I knew the truth. They didn't want me anymore. The orphanage was a tough place, but it shaped me in ways I didn't realize at the time. I learned to fight for myself, to channel my pain and rejection into something constructive. I threw myself into my studies, determined to prove that I wasn't the failure my parents had decided I was. Over time, that determination became my driving force. I excelled in school, earned scholarships, and eventually graduated with honors from law school. Becoming a lawyer wasn't just a career choice. It was my way of reclaiming control over my life. As I built my career, I tried to leave my past behind. I married Mark, a kind and supportive man who became my anchor. Together, we had a baby girl, a beautiful, spirited little girl who reminds me every day what unconditional love looks like. She's my everything, the center of the life I've created from scratch. But even as I focused on my family and career, the shadow of my childhood never fully disappeared. The question of why my parents abandoned me lingered, no matter how much I tried to bury it. Out of curiosity and a lingering need for closure, I looked them up. To my surprise, they were thriving, or so it seemed. My parents and brother were living the life I had been cast out of, their family business growing into a prosperous empire. It stung, even after all these years. Reaching out to the orphanage only confirmed what I already knew in my heart. They never once came back for me. Years later, life took a strange turn. Their business began to crumble, and in their desperation, they turned to a firm for help, the firm where I worked. My boss didn't know about my past and assigned the case to me. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't reveal it. I took on their case, not out of loyalty to them, but because I saw it as an opportunity to prove to myself that I could rise above their betrayal. And now here I am, sitting across from them, facing the very people who once decided I wasn't worth keeping. They still don't know the truth, and I've chosen to keep it that way for now. My priority is saving their company, not for their sake, but for mine. This is my story, and today it's about confronting the ghosts of my past while holding on to the life I've built, a life I'm proud of. "Who do you think you are questioning me like that?" my father said, his voice sharp and dismissive. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze locked on me, as though daring me to challenge him further. I held his stare, my face calm even though my heart pounded in my chest. "I'm the person you hired to fix this," I said firmly, "and if you want me to succeed, I need to understand exactly how this company got into such a mess. That requires honesty from everyone in this room." The tension in the air was suffocating. My brother let out a derisive laugh from across the table, shaking his head. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. "We're supposed to lay it all out for someone who doesn't even know what it means to run a business like this." My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as though he was trying to hold back his frustration. "This company doesn't need lectures. It needs results," he said, his tone clipped. "We've already wasted enough time as it is." I could feel the sting of his words, but I refused to let it show. Keeping my emotions in check was second nature by now, especially with so much at stake. "Then let me do my job," I replied. "That's the only way your company is going to survive." My father's eyes narrowed, but he waved his hand for me to continue. I opened the folder in front of me, scanning the documents I'd spent hours reviewing. "Let's start with the lawsuits," I said, keeping my tone professional. "You're currently entangled in multiple legal disputes, contract breaches, unpaid invoices, and claims of unsafe working conditions on several properties. The negligence alone has left you exposed to potential millions in damages." My brother huffed, leaning back in his chair. "Those lawsuits are exaggerated," he said dismissively. "We've handled worse." I glanced up, leveling him with a firm look. "Exaggerated or not, they're real and they're dangerous. The unpaid invoices have creditors lining up to drag you into court. As for the unsafe working conditions, one of those claims involves serious injuries on a construction site, injuries that could have been prevented with proper oversight. If that case moves forward, it could destroy what's left of the company's reputation." My father shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't interrupt. I pressed on. "Your contracts are another disaster. Most of them are so poorly drafted that they're open to interpretation. In some cases, your team has outright violated terms, like payment deadlines or delivering on agreed timelines. That's the kind of negligence that doesn't just cost money, it costs trust." "And what exactly do you think we should do?" my father asked, his voice gruff but lacking the sharpness it had before. For the first time, he seemed less defensive, more curious. "I propose immediate triage," I said. "First, we settle the most pressing lawsuits out of court. It'll hurt, but it's better than going to trial. Second, we audit every active contract and rewrite anything with vulnerabilities. Third, we establish clear compliance protocols to prevent future violations. You can't afford another lawsuit like the one tied to the injuries." I paused, letting my words sink in. My father looked deep in thought while my brother scowled. "That's a lot of damage control," he muttered, "and a lot of money." "Damage control is all you have left right now," I replied, my voice steady. "But if we do this right, you'll stop the bleeding and buy time to rebuild." That night, after putting our daughter to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with Mark. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher, and I found myself staring at the cup of tea in front of me, untouched. Mark sat down across from me, his concerned eyes studying my face. "Tough day?" he asked gently. I let out a long sigh, finally meeting his gaze. "It's more complicated than I thought," I admitted. "I knew taking this case would be emotional, but now I'm questioning if I've crossed a line." "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "They don't know who I am, Mark. My father, my brother. They have no idea that the lawyer they've hired to save their company is the daughter they abandoned. And here I am, sitting across from them, pretending to be just another professional. Ethically, it feels murky, like I'm deceiving them." Mark nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "But you're not lying to them," he said. "You're doing the job they hired you to do. If anything, you're giving them more than they deserve by even agreeing to help." "I know," I said, running a hand through my hair. "But part of me wonders if I'm doing this for the right reasons. Am I really trying to help them? Or am I just trying to prove something to myself? To them?" Mark reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "You're allowed to have complicated feelings about this, Danielle. What matters is that you're staying true to who you are. You've always believed in doing what's right, even when it's hard. If anyone can navigate this, it's you." His words brought a small smile to my face, but the weight of the situation still lingered. "I just don't want to lose myself in this," I whispered. "You won't," he said firmly. "And no matter what happens, I'll be right here, supporting you every step of the way." The next morning, I walked into the office feeling the weight of the previous night's conversation still lingering. My father and brother were scheduled to come in for a follow-up meeting, and I knew it would be another test of my patience and my resolve. As expected, they arrived 10 minutes late, bickering quietly as they entered the conference room. My father's expression was stern, as always, while Benjamin looked smug, as though he'd already decided I was wasting their time. I greeted them professionally, keeping my tone neutral as I outlined the agenda for the meeting. "Before we dive into specifics, I need to address a critical matter," I began, flipping open a file. "Your most pressing lawsuit involves a contractor suing for breach of contract. The damages they're seeking could sink the company entirely if this goes to trial." My father's face darkened. "That case is baseless," he said sharply. "We've dealt with contractors like this before. They always overreach." "With all due respect," I said, my voice firm, "the evidence against you is strong. There are email correspondences, signed agreements, and missed payments that support their claims. If you don't settle, you risk losing not just the lawsuit but your reputation entirely." Benjamin rolled his eyes. "So what? You want us to just roll over and hand them money?" "I'm suggesting a settlement that mitigates further damage," I replied, locking eyes with him. "The longer this drags out, the worse it will get, for your finances and your name." My father let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in his chair. "And how much is this settlement going to cost us?" he asked, his tone biting. I slid a document across the table. "I've drafted a preliminary offer that should satisfy the contractor while minimizing the financial hit. It's not ideal, but it's the best option given the circumstances." Benjamin grabbed the document and scanned it, his lips curling into a sneer. "This is ridiculous. We shouldn't be paying them a dime. They didn't meet their deadlines either." "Benjamin," I said, keeping my tone steady, "this isn't about what's fair. It's about what's practical. Fighting this in court could cost double what this settlement proposes, not to mention the damage to your already fragile reputation." My father rubbed his temples, his silence indicating he was at least considering my point. "And what about the other lawsuits?" he asked finally. I took a deep breath, preparing myself. "There are 3 additional cases. 2 can be settled with similar offers, but one, a workplace injury claim, has the potential to escalate if it goes to trial. If that happens, we're looking at significant damages and a PR disaster. I recommend bringing in an outside mediator to negotiate a resolution quickly." Benjamin scoffed, throwing the document back onto the table. "You're making this sound like the company is hanging by a thread." "That's because it is," I replied bluntly, meeting his glare. "And if you don't start taking these issues seriously, there won't be anything left to salvage." That night, as I held my daughter in my arms, her tiny hand gripping my finger, memories of the orphanage came rushing back. The cold, sterile walls, the way I clung to my blanket at night, pretending it was my mother's arms around me. But she never came back. She left me there and never looked back. I thought about the day they abandoned me, how my mother avoided meeting my eyes as she whispered promises she never intended to keep. "This is for the best," she had said, her voice trembling. And my father? He didn't even have the courage to show up. He left the dirty work to her, hiding behind his pride and cowardice. I could still picture her walking away, my cries echoing in the orphanage hallway as the door shut behind her. I looked down at my daughter, her soft breathing grounding me in the present. I would never let her feel the way I had felt, forgotten, discarded, invisible. She was my world, and I would do everything in my power to make sure she always knew that. As the meetings progressed over the next few weeks, I began to notice subtle shifts in my father's demeanor. His sharp, dismissive tone when addressing me softened. He started listening more intently when I spoke, occasionally nodding in agreement or asking thoughtful questions about my legal strategies. It wasn't much, but it was different. In contrast, his patience with Benjamin seemed to be wearing thin. Each time my brother interrupted or dismissed my recommendations, My father's irritation became more visible. He would cut Benjamin off mid-sentence or fix him with a withering glare. Once, during a heated discussion about contract renegotiations, my father snapped at him. "If you had been paying attention to the details from the start, we wouldn't be in this mess." I stayed quiet, watching the dynamic between them shift. It was strange, almost unsettling, to see my father treat me with even a hint of respect while growing visibly frustrated with Benjamin. A part of me wanted to speak up, to point out the irony of it all, but I didn't. This wasn't the time to draw attention to myself, or the truth. Instead, I focused on the work. The more progress we made, the more my father seemed to lean on me, trusting my judgment over Benjamin's increasingly defensive outbursts. I could see the cracks forming in their once solid alliance, but I kept my head down and stayed professional. For now, that was enough. At the next meeting, my father's demeanor was almost unrecognizable. He greeted me with a nod and a small smile, something I couldn't remember seeing directed at me, ever. When I presented my updates on the lawsuits, he listened without interrupting, and at one point he even said, "That's a good strategy." The praise caught me off guard, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Thank you," I said simply, jotting down notes as if his words didn't send a ripple of emotions through me. As the meeting went on, his comments became increasingly personal. "You're sharp," he said, almost to himself, as I outlined the mediation approach for the injury claim. "Methodical. You remind me of someone." I glanced at him, unsure where he was going with this. He exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Your precision, the way you think ahead. It reminds me of my wife." His voice softened as he added, "She had a way of seeing through the noise and finding the right path. She passed away last year. She would have liked you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The mention of my mother affected me more than I expected, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to close in around me. My mother. The same woman who left me at that orphanage. The woman who broke every promise she ever made to me. She was gone now, and I'd never have the chance to confront her or ask her why she left me. That made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to scream, to let the truth spill out right there in that room. But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed the storm brewing inside me and forced a polite nod. "Thank you," I managed, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. That night, while Mark put our daughter to bed, I sat on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. Mark eventually walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and placed one in front of me. He sat down beside me, giving me that look he always did when he knew something was bothering me. "You've been quiet since you got home," he said softly. "What's going on?" I sighed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "My dad mentioned my mom today," I said. "He said I remind him of her, that she would have liked me." Mark raised an eyebrow. "How did that make you feel?" "Awful," I admitted, shaking my head. "Not just because he said it, but because she's gone. I didn't even know she had passed until now. I'll never get to ask her why she left me, why she didn't fight for me, and hearing him talk about her as if she were some saint, it was too much." Mark reached over, placing a comforting hand on mine. "It makes sense you'd feel that way. You've carried this pain for so long, and now it's resurfacing in ways you didn't expect. But Danielle, you don't need their answers to find closure. You've built a beautiful life despite what they did to you." I smiled faintly, grateful for his steady presence. "I know," I said quietly. "But part of me wonders if hearing his version of her will change the way I remember her, or if it even matters anymore." Mark squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens, you'll handle it the way you always do, with strength and grace." A couple of months passed, and the transformation was undeniable. The lawsuits had been settled or redirected toward mediation, the contracts were renegotiated with airtight terms, and compliance protocols were finally in place to prevent future disasters. The business was stabilizing, slowly but surely, and even the employees seemed to breathe easier. When the day of the final meeting arrived, I walked into the conference room feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. My father and brother were already seated, their expressions subdued but less hostile than they'd been at the start of all this. My father even stood briefly as I entered, a gesture that caught me off guard. "Well," he said, clearing his throat as I took my seat, "I think we all owe you a thanks for everything." His words were halting, as if he wasn't used to saying them, but they carried a weight that wasn't lost on me. My brother crossed his arms, clearly less enthused. "Let's not get carried away," he muttered under his breath. "We're not out of the woods yet." I ignored him, focusing on the stack of documents in front of me. "No, you're not," I said calmly. "But you're on the right track now. This restructuring has given you a fighting chance, if you follow through and don't fall back into old habits." My father nodded, his face unreadable. "We'll make sure of it," he said, his voice firm. "This company means everything to us." I paused, studying the man who had once walked away from me without a second thought. "Good," I said simply. "Then my job here is done." As I began gathering the documents to close the meeting, Benjamin leaned back in his chair with that familiar smugness. "Well, I guess even a blind squirrel finds a nut sometimes," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. I froze for a moment, but before I could say anything, my father's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Enough, Benjamin," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The sharpness in his tone made us both turn to him in surprise. His face was taut with anger, his eyes burning with a frustration I hadn't seen before. "That's enough out of you." Benjamin looked taken aback, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a retort, but my father didn't give him the chance. He turned to me, his expression softening in a way I never thought possible. His gaze lingered for a moment before he spoke. "I wish you were my son," he said quietly. I sat there, stunned, as his words echoed in my mind. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I looked at him, my hands trembling slightly, but I held his gaze. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the one I had played out in my head so many times. Taking a deep breath, I pushed my chair back and stood, slowly gathering the courage that had been building for years. "I'm not your son," I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And you gave up the privilege of having me as your daughter the day you left me at that orphanage." The color drained from his face. Benjamin's smug expression vanished, replaced by sheer confusion. My father opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. I could see the weight of my words hit him like a freight train, the realization dawning on him slowly, painfully. "You didn't even have the courage to be there," I continued, my voice rising as the floodgates opened. "You left it to her, to my mother, to walk away while I cried and begged her to take me home. And then, you never looked back, not once." I took a shaky breath, letting the emotions pour out. "You left me and you never thought about what that would do to me. I grew up wondering why I wasn't enough, why I wasn't worth keeping. And now, here you were, sitting across from me, asking me to save the company you threw me away for. Well, I did it. I saved your company, Dad." My father stared at me, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that looked like shame. But before he could respond, I glanced at Benjamin, and that's when I realized it. The confusion on his face wasn't just shock. It was deeper than that. He didn't know. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Benjamin blinked, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" he said, his tone defensive. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Of course you don't. They didn't tell you. They never told you about the sister they abandoned." I straightened my posture, the trembling in my hands finally subsiding as resolve took over. "I saved your company," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "Not for you, not for Benjamin, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could rise above what you did to me. that I could be better than the people who left me behind. My father opened his mouth as if to protest, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. But we're done now. For good. Whatever thread of connection might have existed between us is gone. You chose to sever that the day you left me at that orphanage. I turned to Benjamin, meeting his wide-eyed stare. I'm not angry with you, Benjamin. You didn't know, but now you do. I hope you take this chance to be better, to do better. Just don't expect me to stick around to see it. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For once, he looked completely out of his depth, the smugness wiped clean from his face. I could see the weight of the revelation settling on him, but I wasn't here to guide him through it. That wasn't my role, not anymore. Finally, I looked back at my father, my tone softening but remaining firm. At least you taught me something valuable, I said. You taught me exactly what kind of person I never want to be. And for that, I suppose I should thank you. With that, I gathered my things, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving him behind to face the consequences of his actions and his past. Later that evening, I sat on the couch, my daughter nestled in my arms, her tiny fingers gripping mine as Mark handed me a mug of hot chocolate, topped with a swirl of whipped cream. The warmth of my family surrounded me, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I had left behind earlier that day. I'm proud of you, Mark said softly, sitting beside me. I looked down at my daughter, her peaceful face reminding me of everything I had fought for. I'm proud of me too, I said, a quiet smile spreading across my face. For the first time, I felt truly free. Hey there! Did you like the story? If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.